Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last discussion of the digestive system. And in this final discussion, we're going to talk about the processes that occur in the digestive system. There are 6 distinct processes for us to take a look at, and we'll start taking a look at them now. The first process associated with digestion is ingestion. That means getting food in the mouth. Of course, we have to eat in order to be able to get the food in. Once we eat, we chew up the food, and whenever we're ready, we lift up our tongue and we swallow the food. The food then has to be moved through the digestive system, more specifically the alimentary canal or the GI tract, from one place to another as it's acted upon. This is called propulsion. Propulsion involves moving foods from one region of the digestive system to another. Propulsion is accomplished mainly by a process called peristalsis. Peristalsis involves the alternating waves of contraction of smooth muscle tissue, specifically that makes up the muscularis externa, and this alternating waves of contraction moves the food from one place to the next. There is, however, another method in which food is moved, and it technically is considered to be a type of propulsion. It's called segmentation. But segmentation involves moving materials back and forth, and this is important in aiding in the mixing the food, particularly in the small intestine. So as we take a look here, this is the food tube. This could be the esophagus or the small intestine. Here we can see peristaltic contractions of the smooth muscle tissue, um, wall of the alimentary canal or the GI tract. And this is a bolus of food, a little oval piece of food that we swallowed, and it's now, let's say, moving down through the esophagus. These contractions, so we have contractions that occur up here that are going to push the bolus in this direction down towards, let's say, the stomach. As the bolus moves down, contractions continue and continue to push the food down toward the stomach until the bolus makes its way to the opening of the stomach. The cardiac sphincter then will open and allow the food to drop in the stomach. Now, this same process is going to occur that's going to help food move through the small intestine. But additionally, as we look down here at this second diagram, in diagram B here, we can see that what happens is the small intestine begins to pull into segments. And this is due once again to the contraction of the smooth muscle tissue that makes up the muscularis externa. Now what happens is the smooth muscle tissue contracts to form a segment, and within that segment we can see here that the food is kind of swished then back and forth, mixed and churned, similar to what would happen in the stomach. This helps with further mixing of digestive enzymes, gastric juice, and that helps the enzymes be able to attack the nutrients and break them down much more efficiently. So after some swishing back and forth, then what we're going to see is that the segments will relax, the food will drop down to another segment, more contraction will take place, and we'll get more swishing of food back and forth. So this is really kind of a feeble attempt to be able to show that, but that's basically what's happening there. And this process is called segmentation. And it's called segmentation because, again, the connective or the smooth muscle tissue of the muscularis externa causes the small intestine to pull into these various segments in which the food is swished before it's moved along. The next process in the digestive system we have to take a look at is mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion involves mixing of food by the mouth, in the mouth by the tongue, and the churning of food in the stomach. These are the 2 primary methods of mechanical digestion. Now, this is going to be distinguished from what we're going to look at next is chemical digestion. In mechanical digestion, simply what's happening is large food particles are being broken down into smaller food particles. Pardon me. Now, in chemical digestion, we're going to see proteins converted to amino acids, carbohydrates converted to simple sugar, so on and so forth. But mechanical digestion just means breaking the food down into smaller and smaller pieces of the same food. In addition, mechanical digestion is accomplished by segmentation in the small intestine, where the food is going to be switched back and forth, as we mentioned in the previous slide. Our next process is, in fact, chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is going to involve enzymes. Enzymes are going to catalyze the chemical reactions that are going to result in the breakdown of the food into their building block units. So proteins into amino acids, carbohydrates into simple sugars, fats into glycerols and fatty acids. Now, remember that enzymes are specific, so each major food group, proteins, carbs, fats, they're all going to need a different type of enzyme to digest that food group. So each major food group is going to utilize different enzymes. And as I mentioned, carbohydrates are going to be broken down into simple sugars, proteins are going to be broken down into their building blocks amino acids, and fats are going to be broken down into fatty acids and alcohols, more specifically glycerol. The next process we have to take a look at is absorption. So once the food is broken down into its usable parts, proteins into amino acids, fats into fatty acids, and glycerols, carbohydrates into simple sugars, these end products of digestion have to be absorbed, and they're going to be absorbed, taken up to be delivered to the cells either by the blood or the lymph. So for absorption to take place, the food has to enter the mucosal cells first. Remember, those are the cells that are going to make up the mucosa, which lines the lumen of the GI tract. Once it passes through the mucosal cells, the molecules will then be passed either into the blood capillaries or into the lymph capillaries. And then our final process in the digestive system is going to be defecation. Defecation is the elimination of indigestible substances as feces or stool. So we've kind of been talking about really all these processes we've been going along, but we're going to talk about them in a little more detail as we move through this final portion of the digestive system. So here we can see, here's a diagram that just kind of reiterates what we've been talking about. The 6 processes that occur in the digestive system. Ingestion. Once the food is ingested, it has to be moved from one area of the GI tract to the next. Propulsion. Propulsion is going to involve swallowing, peristalsis in the esophagus, stomach, and small intestine, and even in the large intestine. And it's also going to involve segmentation in the small intestine as well. Next, we have mechanical digestion. Processes involving mechanical digestion include chewing, which occurs in the mouth, the churning of food, the mixing of the food in the stomach, and segmentation in the small intestine. So remember, segmentation is going to move food along, but it's also very important in mechanical digestion, breaking food down into smaller and smaller pieces. Once the food is broken down into small pieces, it can then be acted upon by enzymes, and this results in the chemical digestion of the food, the breakdown of proteins to amino acids, carbohydrates to simple sugars, fats to fatty acids, and alcohols or glycerol. Next, we have absorption. Note that absorption is going to be occurring in the small intestine, and food is going to be moving through those mucosal cells and into either the blood capillaries or the lymph capillaries. And then finally, we have the large intestine, and down here at the bottom, where we have the feces collecting in the rectum and then being passed out of the body through the anus, and that process is referred to as defecation. All right, so now we're going to go through these different processes. We're going to take a look at how they occur in each part of the alimentary canal. We're going to begin with the mouth. Mechanical breakdown of food occurs in the mouth. So once the food is injected, we're going to chew it. That's going to physically break the food down into smaller and smaller pieces. Some chemical digestion also occurs in the mouth as the food mixes with saliva. Saliva softens, moistens the food, and also contains an enzyme, salivary amylase, which breaks starches down into a double sugar called maltose that you may have learned about in A&P 1. From the mouth, we move to the pharynx and the esophagus. Remember, these organs are not going to have really any digestive function. They're going to simply serve as passageways to the stomach. So the primary process that's going to occur there is propulsion. And with regard to propulsion, we can take a look at initially moving the food into the pharynx and the esophagus during the process of swallowing. Now, whenever we take a look at swallowing, there are two distinct phases of swallowing. The first phase is called the buccal phase. This is a voluntary phase. It means you decide when you're going to swallow. So you're going to take 10 chews, 20 chews, so on and so forth. This is going to occur in the mouth, and during the chewing process, as the food mixes with saliva, remember it's going to be broken down mechanically, it's going to be moistened, and it's going to be formed into kind of roughly an oval or egg-shaped mass. This oval or egg-shaped mass is referred to as a bolus. So the bolus then, during swallowing, at the end of the buccal phase, is going to be forced into the pharynx by the tongue. So you lift up your tongue and you force the bolus back into the throat. Once the bolus enters the pharynx, this initiates the pharyngeal esophageal phase. This involves a transfer of the bolus from the pharynx to the esophagus. This is an involuntary process, meaning that the autonomic nervous system, once the bolus enters the pharynx, it's going to cause a stretching in the pharynx, and there's going to be an autonomic response, and the smooth muscle, the muscularis externa, is going to begin that wave-like contraction or peristaltic contraction and begin to move the food toward the esophagus. At this time, all the other passageways, except to the stomach, are going to be blocked. The tongue, you already lifted it up, that's going to block off the mouth. The soft palate, or the uvula, is now going to lift and block off the nasopharynx so the food doesn't go back up into the nasal cavity. At this time also, the epiglottis is going to be pushed down to cover the top of the trachea, the larynx, so the food will not go down through the glottis and into the trachea and potentially into the lungs. This causes the food then to move directly into the esophagus. Once in the esophagus, the peristalsis is going to continue to move this egg-shaped mass toward the stomach. Once the food, the mass, the bolus, gets to the top of the stomach, it's going to encounter the cardioesophageal sphincter, or simply the cardiac sphincter. That sphincter will then open when the food presses against it. That's another autonomic response. It's going to open when the food presses against it, and the bolus is going to be delivered into the stomach. So here's just a slide that kind of shows us visually what's going on here. So here's our bolus of food. We've been chewing it up. It's been softened. It's been moistened. And here's the tongue. So we have, at this point in time, the upper esophageal sphincter is contracted, and it's kind of closed off while we're chewing the food. Then we lift up our tongue, force the bolus back into the pharynx, and eventually the esophageal sphincter will relax and the bolus will be, by peristaltic contractions, moved down into the esophagus. Peristalsis will continue, the other passageways will block off, and the food will be moved on toward the stomach. So then the food enters the stomach. It begins to get mixed and churned. Remember, there's a lot of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and this makes the pH of the stomach extremely low. Why does the pH of the stomach have to be extremely low? What's the necessity of an extremely acid environment in the stomach? Well, recall whenever we were looking at the specializations in the mucosa of the stomach that we talked about pepsinogen needing to be converted to pepsin, pepsinogen being the inactive form of pepsin. And it has to be activated to pepsin to begin the protein digestion in the stomach, which is where we want it to occur and not down in the glands or in the walls of the stomach itself. So recall that we said that hydrochloric acid helps to convert the pepsinogen into the active form pepsin for protein digestion. But more than that, even more than that, I guess I should say, uh, the low acid content of the stomach, the hydrochloric acid, provides for a hostile environment for most microorganisms. So notice we noted all along that all the other openings to the outside, the tears, the tear ducts, the eyes, the eustachian tubes from the ears, uh, the mouth, the stomach, everything kind of ties into the stomach. This delivers any microorganisms that are trying to enter through natural openings in the body. It kind of delivers them to the stomach, where the hydrochloric acid, most of them cannot survive the acidity of the stomach, and they are destroyed there. All right, let's take a look at digestion and absorption in the stomach. What kind of digestion takes place? Protein digestion is the primary type of digestion that takes place there. And remember, protein digestion occurs when protein is acted upon by the enzyme pepsin. Pepsin is an active protein digesting enzyme. Now we should just talk here for a little bit about another enzyme called renin. Renin helps to digest milk protein by curdling milk. Most of the time in adults, we do not see renin being produced in the stomach. It's usually produced in young kids to help them with digesting the milk protein. So very little to no renin in adults. With regard to absorption, the only absorption that occurs in the stomach is that of alcohol and aspirin. And this is why we get very quick effects of alcohol and aspirin. So within minutes of imbibing in alcohol, you know, it can enter the bloodstream, go to the brain, and cause changes in brain function. The same holds true with aspirin. It can be absorbed directly through the lining of the stomach, and we can get a very quick analgesic effect from the aspirin. Other substances like NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, and non-NSAIDs that are pain relievers like acetaminophen, they're not absorbed through the lining of the stomach, but what happens is whenever we swallow them, they mix with the chyme and they drop very quickly into the pylorus. And so from the pylorus, they're delivered very quickly into the small intestine and absorption occurs there. So it's a little bit slower effect, but still pretty quick because of that mechanism. All right, how about propulsion in the stomach? Well, before the food can be moved from the stomach to the small intestine, it has to be very well mixed with the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin for protein digestion to occur. But once the food is very well mixed, then there's going to be kind of a rippling peristalsis that occurs in the lower portion of the stomach. Remember, the lower portion of the stomach is called the pylorus, and this is going to help to deliver this liquefied food now into the small intestine. So here's a diagram that kind of shows what happens. Here we have our liquefied food, and we get our rippling peristalsis, and that pushes the liquid on toward the pyloric valve right here. At this time, the pyloric valve is closed, but peristalsis forces the liquid to push against that valve, and the valve automatically opens up for just a split second, and it allows a small amount of chyme to now enter into the small intestine. So how much chyme actually comes out of the stomach at any one time? Well, the pylorus is responsible for controlling or metering out the amount of chyme that enters the small intestine at once. The pyloric region itself can actually hold about 30 milliliters of chyme. That's just a few ounces. And as the rippling peristalsis occurs, this is going to cause, as I said, the pyloric valve to open up. And when it opens up, it's going to open up very quickly and close very quickly. And that's only going to allow about 3 milliliters of the chyme to be released into the small intestine with each peristaltic contraction. This means that the chyme is going to enter slowly into the small intestine. Remember, this chyme has a very low pH from all the acid that's associated with it. That doesn't really cause much problems in the stomach because we have that thick layer of mucus that's in the stomach protecting the wall of the stomach. But once we move into the small intestine, we don't have that thick layer of mucus anymore. And now the hydrochloric acid could cause damage to the wall. So we have to release the chyme very slowly into the small intestine to help prevent that from happening. So as a result of that, depending upon the size of the meal that we eat, it's going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours for the stomach to empty. Okay, so now once the food in this liquefied form called chyme is delivered to the small intestine, now further chemical digestion and mechanical digestion can occur. Where do these enzymes come from that help with the chemical digestion of food? Some of the enzymes come from intestinal cells, which are located in the brush border of the small intestine, in the mucosa of the small intestine. These enzymes primarily break double sugars down into simple sugars, like maltose, which was digested by amylase in the mouth with saliva. We had our starches, our complex carbohydrates, broken down into these double sugars. Now these double sugars are going to pass through the stomach in the chyme. They're going to enter the small intestine. Enzymes are going to enter, and they're going to break those double sugars like maltose down into simple sugars like glucose and fructose. There are also enzymes from the brush border that are going to help to complete some of the protein digestion. So protein digestion essentially begins in the stomach, but that's not where it ends. It's going to continue in the small intestine. Pancreatic enzymes, however, play the major role in digestive function. So what we're saying here is that most of the enzymes for digestion in the small intestine, chemical digestion in the small intestine, are going to come from the pancreas. These enzymes will help complete the digestion of starch, and that's the job of pancreatic amylase that's produced by the pancreas. They also carry out about half of all protein digestion. For example, a new enzyme called trypsin will be delivered to the stomach, as well as other enzymes to help continue the protein digestion. In addition, another enzyme, lipase, there's that ASE at the end. ASE means enzyme, and when we put it together with the root word, lipase is a fat digesting enzyme. So this is also delivered to the small intestine in pancreatic juice. There are also nucleases which digest nucleic acids like RNA and DNA that come from the nucleus of cells from, let's say, muscle tissue whenever we consume the flesh, like a steak or a burger. The pancreatic juice, by the way, is also very alkaline. It has a higher pH. That's going to be very important because that's going to help to neutralize that hydrochloric acid that's in the chyme, and it's going to help to bring the pH of the chyme back up to help to not cause damage to the wall of the small intestine. Now, in addition, there's a lot of water that's going to be absorbed along the length of the small intestine. But most of the water is going to be reabsorbed in the ileum. So as a result of chemical digestion, we get the end products of digestion. Most of these substances are going to be absorbed then by active transport through cell membranes. So that means the cell is going to have to expend energy to move the substances through. Lipids, however, are going to be absorbed by simple diffusion. Once these end products of digestion, the amino acids, the simple carbohydrates, the fatty acids, and alcohols enter the small intestine, they're going to be absorbed, and they're going to be absorbed either into the blood capillaries or into the lymphatic capillaries, the lacteals, if you will, and they're going to be delivered to the liver then by the hepatic portal vein, or they're going to be delivered to the lymph and eventually into the blood and onto the liver, respectively. Okay, how about propulsion in the small intestine? So how does food move through? Well, we really kind of already talked about this. There are two means of propulsion. Peristalsis, again, the wave-like contractions of smooth muscle tissue is going to be the major means. However, there are those segmental movements that we talked about, but they're primarily designed to swish the liquefied food back and forth to help aid with enzymes in making contact with the food to digest it down. So these segmental movements actually kind of mix the food well with the digestive juices that contain the enzymes. But it does also aid in propelling the food through the small intestine. All right, let's move to the large intestine and look at food breakdown and absorption in the large intestine. There are no enzymes that are produced by the cells that line the small intestine. However, there are resident bacteria, what we call normal fauna, that reside in the large intestine, and these bacteria can digest the remaining nutrients. They're digesting those nutrients, breaking them down for themselves, however, not so that they can be delivered into the blood system. However, when they break them down, they have some byproducts that they produce that are important for us. So they produce some vitamin K and vitamin B, but they also have a potential to release gases. And this release of gases builds up in the intestine, and it's known as flatulence, or causes us simply to fart. Okay, so water, vitamins K and vitamin B are then reabsorbed. Now, I got to say that if there's a small amount of these gases that are produced, that small amount of gases can be absorbed and then transported by the blood, and when we exhale, the gas is released into the environment. However, there's only a very small amount of gas that can happen. If we have a larger buildup of gas, that's going to have to be released through the anus, and again, as a part of what we call flatulence. Any remaining materials, either digested or undigested, that haven't been absorbed are going to be released from the anus, from the rectum and anus via the feces or the stool. All right, how about propulsion in the large intestine? Well, there is peristalsis that does occur to help keep moving food through the large intestine, but the peristalsis is going to be kind of sluggish. And again, that's because the muscularis externa has been reduced to 3 bands of smooth muscle tissue, the 10 E. coli, so you're not going to get um, very quick contractions. Instead, basically what's going to happen is food's going to build up, or the stool is going to build up, and then there's going to be a kind of a stretch of the large intestine, and that's going to stimulate a peristalsis, a kind of sluggish peristalsis, and the food is going to move in mass. So the peristaltic contractions tend to be slow, but they tend to be pretty powerful. These mass movements only occur about 3 or 4 times per day, and as a result of that, we're going to defecate 1 or 2 times per day would be about normal. So as these powerful movements, however, move the food from the large intestine into the rectum is going to distend, and it's going to be able to act as a storage tank for the feces or stool as it enters. Now, eventually what's going to happen is the rectum is going to be stretched to a certain point that and that's going to set off an autonomic response. There's going to be a defecation reflex, and there's an internal anal sphincter that's going to be relaxed, and that's going to allow the feces to begin to move to the outside. However, defecation is not going to occur until the external anal sphincter relaxes. So this gives us the ability to have the urge to defecate, but not defecate right then and there. We can actually then hold it and wait until we can get to a bathroom so that we can defecate in an appropriate way. At that time, we decide when the external sphincter is going to open, and the stool passes out of the body. That's kind of the nicest way I can think of to say it. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion. I tried to keep this under 30 minutes, and it looks like we did that. So I hope you got what you need out of this, and we'll be ready for moving on to our test.